want to do something a little different in this video. I'm going to offer you a free undergraduate level history course. It's a course I've been teaching for 17 years, a course on the United States and the Middle East since 1783. It's probably the best enrolled course of all the courses that I taught during my almost 40-year career of teaching. I'm going to offer it to you for free. Now, free means you don't have to buy any books, you don't have to pay me, you don't have to take any tests, you don't even have to attend. Of course, the downside is you don't get any actual college credit for the course. But hopefully you'll learn something, and you'll find the various videos interesting. Now, what I hope to do in this course is to give you some sort of context for what's happening in the world today, in the sense of the U.S. is involved in the Middle East and with terrorism. My experience teaching, most of the students that I come into contact with in the classroom or online view the U.S. relationship with the Middle East as something recent, something that happened during or since World War II. Usually when I ask people why we're involved there, the two answers I get is, it's all about oil, it's all about Israel. Of course, Israel didn't exist till 1948. Oil wasn't an issue to the 20th century. And of course starts in 1783. So why were we interested in the Middle East in 1783? And that's basically what the course is about. We have many interests in the Middle East. Oil's a big one. Israel's a big one. But they're not the only ones. And they're not the only things that only recently propelled us there. The other thing I get a lot from the students, because it's an environment in which they've been educated today, is that what's happening today is somehow the fault of Western imperialism and colonialism. And, to an extent, part of that is the fault of the U.S. It's the chickens coming home to roost because of all that we've done, interventions, this, that, and the other thing. That's just as wrong as the idea that this is a recent phenomenon. As I said, we've been there. We've been interested in the Middle East for a long time. One of the things I do first, on that first day, after I get rid of the administrative details, is to show them on an overhead, or later on with technology on a computer overhead, different overhead, what I'm going to read to you now. And please bear with me, it's not that long, but it's very important. Imagine a civilization that once outstripped the West in virtually every measure before something went wrong. Imagine that civilization victimized by Western encroachment, colonialism, and imperialism. Imagine some of the lands of that once great civilization still occupied in the 21st century by Westerners or their proxies. Imagine a people who must still bear the presence of American naval vessels operating in local waters. Imagine the frustration of that civilization's people, men and women proud of their illustrious history and heritage, who see themselves and their culture derided in the West as somehow backward, something other, something oriental. Now, I would read that to them, and then I'd ask them, what region in the world am I talking about? And of course, it's in the U.S. and Middle East, so all the hands would go up, Middle East, Middle East, Middle East. And then I would say to them, no. That paragraph could apply to the Middle East. Everything in it could apply to the Middle East. But it's actually a paragraph I wrote about China for a different purpose. What's the point? Well, the point is, what most Americans are told is that what's happening in the world today is somehow a result of Western imperialism and colonialism. And the point I'm trying to make is that Western imperialism and colonialism hit the Middle East for sure, but it also was applied to China. So the obvious question then is, why don't we see young Chinese men, hijacking aircraft and flying them into American landmarks? Why don't we see young Chinese men strapping on dynamite vests, suicide vests, walking into pizza parlors in Taipei, Taiwan, and blowing themselves up with a bunch of innocent teenagers? Why don't we see young Chinese arming themselves with automatic weapons, going into gay clubs in Orlando, Florida, and killing 60 people? Why don't we see young Chinese getting minivans and driving them into crowds of non-Chinese people in an effort to kill them, yelling, "China is great," as they do so? Do you ever see those things? You don't. What do you see with regard to China? Well, then I would ask the students, how many of you have something on you today that was manufactured in China? And the majority of the hands would go up, 3/4 of the hands. An iPhone or headphones or a laptop, something manufactured in China. What about at home? Every hand, of course, would ultimately go up. Everybody had something made in China. Then I'd ask them, how many of you are carrying something around now manufactured in the Middle East, or more specifically the Arab world? I rarely got a hand. What about at home? And don't count, petroleum in your car, which may or may not come from the Middle East. Our biggest oil source of oil imports is actually Canada, not any of the Arab world. And maybe I get one hand up. Somebody had been there, or his parents had been there, and they brought something back. But other than that, nothing. One time I was in a store shopping, and I saw these Egyptian cotton towels. And I said, well, I got to buy these, because next year when I teach my course, I can say, well, at least I have, an Egyptian cotton towel. But then when I got them home, and I was folding them after I did the laundry, I noticed they'd actually been made in India. So even the Egyptian cotton towels were made in India. So why? Why is China so busy making stuff, exporting stuff? And what's exported from the Islamic world is, other than oil, is terror. Why is that? They're both victims of Western imperialism and colonialism, but they're responding differently. People like to say that imperialism and colonialism is the cause. But if it's the cause, it should be the cause in both cultures, and it's not. So what's the difference between Chinese culture and Islamic culture? What's one glaring, obvious point? What's one habit the other one doesn't have? Well, one is Islamic, the other one's Chinese. And even today, what's Chinese culture? What's left of it? The substrate, the upper levels of Chinese culture are driven by the Communist Party. What's communism? What was that? Is that an Eastern idea? No, it's a Western idea. It's a Western conception. And what's the substrata of Chinese society? Capitalism. Again, a Western economic development. So we see Chinese as East Asian, which it is, but in many ways, in terms of its politics and economics, it's Western. That's not true in the Islamic world. The Islamic world is called the Islamic world for a reason, because it's dominated by Islam, which isn't just a religion. It's something big, much bigger than that. My argument, my hypothesis, if you will, for the course, is that the problem in the Islamic world today, the problems, were caused primarily by 5 factors, 4 of which were internal. What were those factors? The dhimmi system, military slavery, pause, resume, both of which were internal. The failure in the 16th century to adopt the printing press. The Ottoman Empire didn't allow printing until the mid-19th century. They didn't have a printing press in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, until after my birth in the 1950s. What would the impact on the West be if somehow the Catholic Church had managed to outlaw printing when Gutenberg set up his first printing press? Because that's what happened in the Islamic world, and people don't talk about it. Pause. Resume. The 4th factor were the horrible, destructive invasions of the Mongols in the 13th century and the Timurids who came after. Neither of those have anything to do with the West. And yet the Islamic world, all they ever talk about is the Crusades. But what really did the damage to the Islamic world were the Mongols and later on the Timurids. And it's because of that damage that the Islamic world, which had been flourishing intellectually in many ways, stops flourishing, totally misses out on what's happening in the West, which we term the Renaissance, and doesn't get anything close to anything like the Enlightenment, which comes later on in the West. Back in, I think it was 2003, there was an interesting UN report. As a matter of fact, it was so interesting, the UN was forced to not ever do it again, because there's all kinds of statistics in there about the Islamic world. For example, the entire Arab world, 300 to 350 million people, not counting oil, taking oil out of the equation, but everything else they make is less valuable, has less GDP value than the output of Finland with 5 million people. Even if you throw in oil and all that comes with that, the 350 million people of the Arab world are less productive than Spain, with about a seventh of the population, a sixth of the population. There was damning statistics on how they were being held back by the fact that basically they don't use half their population, women. Whereas in the West, women occupy all kinds of positions and are productive in many different sectors. They didn't like that at all. And of course, one of the most interesting statistics to me, and this gets back to the failure to adopt the printing press until the 19th century, was that every year, each year, in Spain, more books are translated from foreign languages into Spanish than have been translated into Arabic since the 10th century. Think about that. If you talk about sharing knowledge and bringing in knowledge from other countries and other languages, Spain does more in a year than the entire Arab world has done in over 1,000 years. There are two other things I used to tell them the first day. And I remember back in 2003 when I first told them, I got, looks of disbelief. I think some of the people thought I was crazy. But I've run into some of them. I'm still in contact with some of my early students. And they realize now that I knew what I was talking about. What were those two things I told them on the first day? The first thing was that whatever you want to call what's going on in the world today, terror, global war on terror, Islamic global jihadist problems, whatever you want to term it, whatever you consider correct, politically correct, whatever it is, I told them on the first day in 2003 that they were going to live with this the rest of their lives. And I'm sure they didn't believe me. But 17 years later, the last time when I taught last spring, I taught the course for my final time. I told the class, same thing I've told all the other classes I've taught for 17 years. You're not going to live to see the end of this. And I would say it to you as well. What's the second thing I told them about that I mentioned? The second thing was that if you look at modern political jihadism, now some people would argue that political jihadism goes back to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. But if you look at the modern version of what's going on, it developed in the mid-1920s in Egypt, then occupied by the British, and British India. Think Pakistan today, but that whole area also occupied by the British, controlled by the British. And I said, if you look at these movements and you look at their history, each successive generation has been A, more numerous, there have been more of them than the previous generation, and B, more extreme, more violent than the previous generation. That's a trend that's been going on for almost a century. And if you've been around since 2001, you've seen it. Remember how horrible we thought Al-Qaeda al-Jihad was? What a bunch of barbarians, terrorists, these Horrible people. Look at what they did. Not just here, but in Afghanistan and other places. How could you be any worse than Al-Qaeda? And then, a little over a decade later, along comes the Islamic State. And they made Al-Qaeda look like a bunch of slackers with what the Islamic State was doing. Genocide. Slavery. Enslaving women as sex slaves. Slave markets. Operating. Being filmed. And what I tell the students is the next generation is going to be bigger and worse. The obvious question is, where does it end? The book I wrote, developed out of this course, ends with the warning, the abyss beckons, because that's where we're headed. So how will it end? Shot 7. So how will it end? I don't know. I have some ideas, but you're going to have to wait till the end of the course to find out. But for now, let me just say, I ended the book with the warning that the abyss beckons. It sort of gives you a clue that I'm somewhat pessimistic. I mean, this can come to an end, but only if the West acts in a collective and coherent fashion, and the Islamic world acts in a coherent and collective fashion, and these two larger groups cooperate. If all those things happen, this can be stopped. What's the likelihood of those two things happening? I would say it's under 5%. It's basically, as far as I'm concerned, nil. I mean, it's been almost 20 years since 9/11, and it still hasn't happened. In many ways, the West is less cooperative today than they were 20 years ago. And the Islamic world, it just goes on. So the drift of this process I'm talking about, of each successive generation being worse, could very well end, especially in an age of increasing nuclear proliferation, with atomic weapons used as a terror weapon against the West. And these groups have already said if they get their hands on them, they will use them. That could be how it ends. If you feel like you got something out of this video, give it a thumbs up, share the video with friends, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification button so you'll know when I post new videos. I'd also ask you, and I'm sincere in this, to comment, because there's questions I would like to know before I go on. Do you think you'd be interested in this course? Again, you don't have to pay for it. I'm not asking for Patreon support or anything. I'm not asking for a penny. It's free. It's a gift. But I don't want to spend the time recording the lectures, working them up, searching for visuals and things like that, if I'm not going to get a lot of people watching. So please give me a comment and be honest. Sorry, I can't be bothered. That's fine. I don't mind. It's not going to hurt my feelings. There's other things I can do. If you are interested and you would like to see me keep going, let me know. If there's other courses you might like to see that I teach, I used to teach a course on, used to call it Plato to NATO. It was war and society from the Stone Age to the present. I could do that. I used to do another course on the early national period, 1763 to 1815, which includes the Revolution, the Constitution, the Convention, all that kind of stuff, which is in the news today. Why we have a federal republic, why we don't have a democracy. That was also a very well-enrolled course. I also taught one that the ROTC cadets all took, was a course on U.S. military history from the colonial times to the present. I could do that. So if any of these things appeal to you, if this course appeals to you, if it's something you would like to see me continue, please let me know in the comments. I'd really appreciate it. I enjoy doing this. It's something I've been doing my entire life. I've retired now. I need an outlet. So I don't see it as a labor. It's a labor of love in many ways, but I really don't want to waste my time if, I'm going to have like 3 people watch the videos. It's just not worth it. So I would appreciate comments. And with that, I'll just end it here and see what happens. And hopefully there'll be a second introductory video in moving this course along. And until the next time, thank you.